Welcome back, everyone. This video is going to be going over David Hume's famous problem of induction. So in this video, we're just going to start with a preview of Hume's problem. Then we're going to break it down. And we're going to give a little bit of background by discussing Hume's distinction between relations of ideas versus matters of fact, his discussion of cause and effect. Then we'll talk about induction as a form of reasoning. And then we'll talk about why he thinks that induction assumes what he calls the uniformity of nature. All right, so let's start just by giving a preview of the argument. Hume's idea is, look, we have a number of beliefs about unobserved matters of fact. We believe a number of things that we haven't actually observed ourselves. He says those beliefs can only be justified by using induction from our past experiences. All right, now he says, but those inductive arguments, they only justify their conclusions if we're justified in believing in the uniformity of nature. All right, so beliefs about unobserved matters of fact can only be justified if we're justified in believing that nature is uniform. So he says, how can we justify that principle? Well, he says any justification for the principle concerning the uniformity of nature needs to be either a priori, using our thought alone, or from our previous experience with nature via some inductive argument from past experience. He says, but the uniformity of nature can't be justified a priori, since we could deny the uniformity of nature and there would be no contradiction. He says, but it also can't be justified using our past experiences, since that would end up being circular. It would end up assuming the very thing we're trying to prove. Thus, beliefs about unobserved matters of fact cannot be justified. All right, now, leading up to this, Hume distinguishes two kinds of truths. There's relations of ideas and matters of fact that we've already discussed. So, relations of ideas, these are truths where denying them would lead to a contradiction, because essentially your denying them would contradict the various ideas themselves. And because of that, just by using our thought to inspect our ideas can lead us to knowledge of these kinds of truths. So, some examples. Hume says 3 times 5 is equivalent of the half of 30, so equals the half of 30. The idea is, just by thinking about these mathematical claims, we can realize that they're true because these are claims about the relations between our ideas. So all we need to do is inspect the ideas themselves. I think an easier example is all bachelors are unmarried. The idea here is this is a truth about the relation of these ideas because the reason all bachelors are unmarried is because the idea of being unmarried is literally a part of our idea of a bachelor. And so by noticing that relation, that the idea of being unmarried is part of our idea of being a bachelor, we can thereby recognize that all bachelors have to be unmarried just by inspecting that idea. Compare that to matters of fact. These are cases where the truth is something that we could deny without any contradiction. And because of that, we can't just inspect these ideas to know that they're true. Since they could be true, they could be false. In order to know that they're true, we need to check using our experience. So I'm wearing a gray t-shirt. This is true, but it didn't have to be true. It's possible I'm wearing a gray t-shirt. It's possible that I'm wearing a red t-shirt. So in order to know which of those things are true, you need to use your experience. You look at the screen, you see the gray shirt, and so you believe Sam's wearing a gray t-shirt. Or the sun will rise tomorrow. Yet again, this is something I can imagine the sun not rising tomorrow. There's no contradiction in the sun not rising tomorrow. And so I can only know whether the sun's going to rise tomorrow by appealing to my experience. But among these matters of fact, we need to distinguish between the observed matters of fact versus the unobserved matters of fact. So for the sake of argument, Hume allows that the testimony of our senses and memory will provide us with knowledge of at least some matters of fact. He actually questions this at other points in sort of his writing, but he's going to sort of grant it for the sake of argument here. So he assumes our senses provide us knowledge with our immediate surroundings. So I can see the fan on my ceiling, I can see the Diet Cokes to my left, and my senses tell me about my surroundings. My memories give me knowledge about what I have previously experienced or previously observed. And so these are both cases where our belief is, to put it in Hume's own terms, essentially just a direct copy of an impression, either that we had in the past or that we presently have. So the belief just is the idea, the copy of that past impression. That idea is lively enough that it actually affects our sort of actions, and that's what makes it qualify as a belief. But the belief there is just literally a copy of a past impression that we've had. Let's just call those observed matters of fact. They are observed via our senses. But what about the unobserved matters of fact? What could justify these beliefs? So a few examples of unobserved matters of fact. They're mostly from Hume, but not all of them. So my belief that the sun will rise tomorrow. Notice I haven't seen it happen because it hasn't happened yet. Or I believe that the next time I eat bread, it's going to nourish me. Yet again, I believe this, but it's not a copy of any past impression since this hasn't happened yet. I believe that a billiard ball will move the next time I see it struck by another billiard ball. Yet again, this is a belief about something I haven't observed yet. This is not just this idea of the billiard ball moving in the future is not a copy of a past impression or a current impression since it hasn't happened yet. If I were to find a watch or machine on a deserted island, I might come to believe that a human being had previously been on that island, even though I never saw them. So I don't have that sort of idea copied from a past impression and retained via memory since I wasn't there when the other human was. I also believe that dinosaurs once roamed the earth. I have this belief even though I never observed dinosaurs. So my idea here is not just a copy of a past impression that I have had. So according to Hume, when we analyze any of our reasoning about these unobserved matters of fact, they all sort of dissolve into beliefs we have about causes and effects. So I believe the sun will rise tomorrow. That depends upon a number of beliefs I have about sort of the Earth's rotation and then its orbit around the sun so as to bring the sun into view as tomorrow comes. When I eat pizza for dinner tonight, yet again, I have a number of beliefs about sort of food causing nourishment in human bodies and stomachs digesting food, etc. When I hit the 8-ball with the cue ball at a particular angle, I believe that the 8-ball will move in the direction of that pocket on the pool table. So this is largely because I have beliefs about how motion causes and impacts cause other objects to move. So cause and effect. There's an impact to the cause. The effect is the 8-ball moving. I believe that people used to be on this deserted island since I found a watch on it. The idea here is the effect is the watch, but I think that kind of effect is the result of a cause, a person putting those pieces together so as to produce the watch. Dinosaurs once roamed the earth. I believe this because I notice that there are fossils in the ground. I notice the effect and I think, well, what would cause bones to be in the ground? Well, I have the idea that this would happen because if there's an animal with a skeleton, it dies. Over time, this causes its sort of body to decay and the bones stay. And if they are in rock, they can then, through a geological process, cause them to become fossilized and stay over time, thus causing me to find them later on. So I have those beliefs about causes and effects, and that's why when I find the dinosaur bones, I come to believe that even though I didn't see it, these dinosaurs once walked on the earth alive. So, in order to understand what kind of evidence might justify our beliefs about unobserved matters of fact, we need to consider how do we get evidence? How do we get knowledge about what causes what, about these causal relationships? So, these truths about causes, about one thing causing another, is that a relation of our ideas, or is that a matter of fact? Hume says, let an object be presented to a man of ever so strong natural reason and ability. So imagine a person with perfect reasoning. If that object is entirely new to him, he will not be able, by the most accurate examination of its sensible qualities, to discover any of its causes or effects. Adam, though his rational faculties are supposed entirely perfect at the very first, could not have inferred from the fluidity and transparency of water that it would suffocate him. So no matter how smart you are, if I just show you a glass of water, you see its sort of fluidity, you see its sort of transparency, all these things you can see with your senses, none of that tells you. So if you look at the sort of ocean, you wouldn't be able to infer that if you go under there that you would suffocate. All right. Or he says, when you look at a fire, you see the light, you see the warmth, you don't realize, like, just looking at it is not going to tell you that if you were to go into the fire, it would burn you and cause you to die. He says, our reason cannot, unassisted by experience, ever draw any inference concerning real existence and matter of fact. All right. So essentially, Hume is relying on two claims here. First, according to Hume, we never actually experience causation itself. All right. Second, according to Hume, the denial of any causal relation does not lead to a contradiction. So there's no contradiction in the idea that you could go into a fire and just not burn up and survive. There's no contradiction that you could go underwater and not suffocate, just like a fish, essentially. Thus, you can't gain any knowledge about causes merely by inspecting the ideas themselves. So Hume also gives the example of a billiard ball. So the idea is take two billiard balls, when one sort of runs into the other and makes it move. The claim is, if you had never seen that before, if you just think about the idea, you cannot reason that it's going to cause the other billiard ball to move. Because all I see is one billiard ball hit another billiard ball and then the other one move in another direction. I don't actually see the billiard ball cause the other one to move. Similarly, look, if I'm just using my reason, the idea of one billiard ball hitting another one, I can imagine that the other billiard ball goes off in one direction. I can imagine that it sort of shoots straight up in the air. I can imagine that it just sort of stops and sits there. There's no contradiction in any of those other effects happening as a result. And so I can't just use my reason to determine what causes what. So, our beliefs about causal relations, about causes and effects, can't be justified just by using our thoughts alone. And our beliefs about these causal relations can only be justified by experience. But it can't just be by one experience because I don't actually see the causal relations. So how can experience justify beliefs about causes and about unobserved matters of fact? Now, it looks like the way we come to these beliefs is not because we see one thing cause another, but rather we see this thing happen over and over and over. We see it happen multiple times, and so we assume that there's some connection there, sort of holding those things together. But Hume says even after we have experience of the operations of cause and effect, our conclusions from that experience are not founded on any reasoning or any process of the understanding. All right. So let's focus our discussion a bit more just by focusing on unobserved matters of fact concerning the future. So Hume's fundamental insight is that all our beliefs about the future rest on what we can refer to as the principle of the uniformity of nature. And this is just our belief that the future is going to tend to resemble the past, or the unobserved is going to tend to resemble the observed. So let's consider an example. I have a belief that eating bread tonight is going to provide me with nourishment, one of Hume's examples. So I can't know a priori that the bread I will eat tonight will cause me to be nourished. I can't just think about this and know it to be true, because there's no contradiction in me eating the bread and dying as a result. I believe that the bread will cause nourishment in me because bread has always had the powers to give me nourishment in my past experience. So he says, the bread which I formerly ate nourished me. That is, a body of such sensible qualities was at that time endowed with such secret powers to provide me with nourishment. But does it follow that other bread must also nourish me at another time, and that like sensible qualities must always be attended with like secret powers? So the italicized part here is this assumption of the uniformity of nature. When I believe that because bread has nourished me in the past, it's going to nourish me next time I eat it, I am assuming that similar sensible qualities, a similar looking thing, bread, since it's similar to the bread I ate earlier, it's going to similarly have the same secret powers, the same causal powers. All arguments from experience are founded on the similarity which we discover among natural objects, and by which we are induced to expect effects similar to those which we have found to follow from such objects. So I notice the bread I'm going to eat tonight is similar to the bread I ate yesterday. Yesterday, the bread nourished me. And so since this bread is similar to this previous bread, I assume it's going to have a similar effect. I assume that the future is going to resemble the past in this way. So, when we make this underlying assumption explicit, our reasoning about this future unobserved matter of fact looks like the following. Every piece of bread I've eaten in the past had the power to nourish me. Well, the future tends to resemble the past, and so probably the bread I eat in the future will have the power to nourish me. Now notice, I don't say that the future is going to exactly resemble the past. Some people have said that Hume's problem of induction is just pointing out that inductive arguments aren't deductive, that their premises leave open the possibility that their conclusion is false, and that's why they're bad. That's not Hume's argument. He never says that the future is going to exactly resemble the past, but he says, don't we at least have to know that the past is going to be a reliable guide to the future in order to use induction to justify our beliefs about the future? So it says the future tends to resemble the past. That's what we need. The past is a reliable guide, even if it's not a perfect guide. We would need that in order to at least know that it's probable that this will happen in the future. But now the question becomes, how do I justify that assumption that the future is going to tend to resemble the past, that the past is going to be even a reliable guide to the future? All right, so how do we justify this belief in the uniformity of nature? Well, we can't justify it using our thought alone. It can't be justified a priori or demonstratively, as Hume says, because there's no contradiction in nature drastically changing course. So it's possible that causes and effects, it's possible that tomorrow the law of gravity just totally changes. We can imagine that. And so since there's no contradiction, the law of gravity is not a sort of truth about the relations of our ideas. It's a truth about the matter of fact, because we can imagine gravity changing. We can imagine the laws of motion changing. We can imagine the law of thermodynamics being different. And it could change. We can imagine the laws of nature changing every single day. So we can imagine nature being completely irregular and not uniform, where the future doesn't resemble the past. All right. So objects' secret nature, and consequently all their effects and influence may change without any change in their sensible qualities. This happens sometimes, and with regard to some objects. Why may it not happen always with regard to all objects? See it again, this is like that. Yes, gravity is held so far, but I can imagine gravity changing tomorrow and then the next day. So there's no contradiction in that. So why should I assume that it's not going to? Why should I assume that nature is going to be uniform or tend to be uniform? All right, so you might say, okay, well, let's just appeal to our experience, and we can't justify this a priori, so we'll just use our experience. So in the past, nature has tended to be uniform. The future has tended to resemble the past. So gravity didn't change yesterday, and it didn't change the day before that, didn't change the day before that. So in the past, this law of gravity has been consistent. Nature has been uniform. Therefore, probably in the future, it's going to continue to be uniform as well. The future will continue to tend to resemble the past. But there's no contradiction in the premise being true while the conclusion is false. And so the inference from 1 to 2, I'm assuming that my past experience with the uniformity of nature is a reliable guide to the future uniformity of nature. And so in my past experience, the future is tended to resemble the past. Well, the future tends to resemble the past. So in the future, probably the future is going to continue to resemble the past. It's going to continue to be uniform. But notice number 2 here. I'm assuming the very thing I'm trying to prove. So when I say nature's been uniform in the past, therefore it's going to be uniform in the future, I am assuming the uniformity of nature in that inference. And so the argument is circular. So Hume's point is any attempt to justify the reliability of induction from past experience. So induction's been reliable in the past, so it's going to be reliable in the future, will inevitably end up being circular. It's just going to assume that induction is reliable and thereby fail to give us any justification. All right, so let's look at this argument again. Beliefs about unobserved matters of fact can only be justified by induction from past experiences. So the sun rising tomorrow, I can imagine that doesn't happen. And so I need to say, well, I think the sun will rise tomorrow because it's risen every day in the past so far. But induction only justifies its conclusions if we're justified in believing the uniformity of nature. So the fact that the sun has risen every day in the past only gives me reason to believe that it's going to rise tomorrow if I am justified in assuming that nature is uniform, tends to be the same. So my belief that the sun will rise tomorrow can only be justified if I'm justified in believing in the uniformity of nature. But any justification that nature is uniform is either going to be a priori or using induction from past experience. But the uniformity of nature can't be justified a priori, since I can imagine nature changing all the time. The rules of nature, the way it operates. I can imagine gravity changing randomly. I can imagine the laws of thermodynamics changing randomly. They haven't so far, but I can imagine it. Then you might say, but they haven't so far. And so the fact that they haven't changed, that they have stayed the same for this much time, they're going to stay the same. Gravity's not going to suddenly change tomorrow since it hasn't changed in the past. But it is, we can't do that because that would be circular. I'd be saying, well, I know that nature's going to be uniform because it's been uniform in the past. Well, I'm assuming that the uniformity in the past is a good guide to how nature's going to behave in the future. And you can't justify a claim by assuming that very claim. Thus, we're out of options, and beliefs about unobserved matters of fact cannot be justified. I'm going to give you an alternative formulation that doesn't use Hume's terminology. You can think of it this way. Inductive arguments, they can't guarantee their conclusion. But in order to justify their conclusion, we have to at least be justified in believing that they are reliable, that they're usually going to lead to true conclusions, even if not always. But the only way to justify the claim that induction would be reliable would be to either give an a priori argument for its reliability, or to give an inductive argument, an argument from experience, past experience. But the reliability of induction can't be justified a priori because I can imagine induction being unreliable. There's no contradiction in induction being unreliable. The reliability of induction also can't be justified using an inductive argument. I can't say, look, I used induction 2 weeks ago and it got it right. I used induction this next time and it got it right. I used induction the next day and it got it right. Therefore, when I use induction tomorrow, it's going to get it right as well. You can't use induction to justify induction. In the same way, you can't use a magic 8-ball to justify the magic 8-ball. And so, since both of these avenues for justifying induction fail, we just can't justify the reliability of induction. And thus, when we use inductive arguments, when we use past experience to form beliefs about unobserved matters of fact, we're not justified in those conclusions. So that's it for this video. See y'all next time. Bye-bye.